work, what they can generate for the economy, and what kind of jobs they're allowed to take, because the UK also has what is called a restricted labour access, so only certain categories of jobs are available to foreigners. Aside from that, it's also implemented what it calls a sponsorship system. So now the sponsorship system basically forces organizations that want to bring in migrants to become sponsors. For that, of course, they have to pay a fee. Depending on the size of your organization, the fee is more or less hefty. In virtue of having become a sponsor, which is the only way that you're allowed to bring in migrants, you also have certain duties. Your only freedom by having bought into the system is to bring in migrants. But your duties are to make sure that those migrants comply to all the rules that they have to comply to. And that also means that you have to survey them. So this has brought in a culture of suspicion and fear, because if you're found to have breached any of the rules, or if the migrants that you've brought in are found to breach any of the rules, your license is thus withdrawn. Now, in a very, very fickle economy, that means that you lose the ability to generate money if you're a university, for example, because universities largely depend on the revenue that they draw from international students. And if you're a company, that means that ultimately, until you can reapply, which generally takes a very long time, you're no longer able to hire new migrants. And that's a very big loss for your company. So it has ultimately generated a situation where private institutions are more and more tied to the states. And they're more and more likely to be dictated by the states what they can and what they can't do, not only in terms of who they can bring in, but equally how they can do it. So the length of time that you're able to hire somebody for is one example. Equally, if you're a university, it also means that in certain, well, actually not university, but if you're an education provider, it also means that to certain extents, the courses that you offer where you also have practical experience, work experience, is dictated by the government, by the Home Office. Because unless you're a university and unless you have public funding, the amount of time that you can offer your students on work placement has been shortened. Now, whether it is for the state to decide what is best in the interest of the academic staff and the students, I do not think is right. They do not have the experience, nor do they have the ethic to actually have the sound judgment to make that call. So, having kind of laid out what the situation is in the UK, I'll break it down in terms of how it affects various civil rights, and I'll give you some examples. So, primarily, migration policies define an individual's right to a private life, simply because your dependents might not be allowed in the country. Again, because if they do not score correctly in terms of financial, in terms of education, in terms of how well they master the language, they will not be allowed entry into the country. Now, effectively, this means that a lot of people who might want to come to the UK to study or to work will be deprived of their right to carry on their private life with their partners or their children, whoever it might be. What also happens, and this is more specific to academia in the UK, if you're a foreign student and you require a visa, and you're coming for courses that are less than 12 months, the government simply no longer allows you to bring migrants unless those migrants can actually qualify for a visa of their own right. Which basically means that mature students who have a partner or who have children, or let's say the case of many Muslim young women who require a chaperone to come into a country, will simply not be allowed to have access to a series of courses, mainly master courses. Again, whether it's for a government to decide who actually has the right to choose a course and who has the right to live their life on their own terms, I think is not correct. But migration policies not only make it hard for migrants to carry out their private lives as they see fit, it also ultimately affects the ability of their own nationals to live their private lives as they see fit. And with the Manifesto Club, we've come across the case of a Nigerian British couple. They reside in Nigeria, but both of them wanted to come to the UK for a visit, for a 6-month visit, so on a tourist visa. Simple. Now, because the woman had previously been allocated a visa, but ultimately decided not to use that visa, for some reason, the border agent who treated her case decided she wouldn't be given a visa this time. So this UK citizen, who has every right to come to his own country and should have the right to bring his partner, to actually enjoy the country that she has a tie to, both of them decided not to come. It had no meaning for him to come to his country without his wife. Now, I do not see how a state can forbid its own citizens to actually make the choice of who it is they decide to live with and how it is that they decide to live with that partner. A second effect of migration policies on individuals' rights is obviously their right to determine their professional lives. Of course, the general debate is that we are living in a very tough world, and the economy is extremely strained, and that governments should be thinking of their own people before anything else. And so they should restrict the job market to the nationals in their own country. But this completely contradicts the right to better your own life. This actually impedes your right to seek out the job that you absolutely desire to do, just like it prevents you from carrying out and showing to the world those abilities that you have. And reversely, it prevents companies from actually picking the very best individuals for the job, just like it prevents companies from actually retaining those individuals. And currently, our government, well, thankfully I'm not a British national in that aspect, but the current government, the Conservative government, not satisfied with the points-based immigration system, has decided to tighten the screws. So it's brought in a migration cap. It's very arbitrarily decided a number of migrants who would be allowed within the country per year. So it's ultimately telling companies, this is your quota. If you're a sponsor, if you buy into the system, this is the number of migrant workers that you're allowed to bring in per month. That's it. After that, tough luck. What it kind of oversaw is that this will also impact renewing visas for the workers that they have. Now, in many cases, it makes absolutely no sense for a company to hire and retrain an individual when that person absolutely and perfectly fits in the company's culture, when that person has developed personal ties with its colleague, when that person has been conducting a project, isn't the best fit to actually carry out that project. So not only are companies prevented from hiring exactly who they want, but they're also, in certain cases, there's a jeopardy on them retaining the employees that they have. This is particularly problematic for certain areas, and namely academia, because the way that the points-based immigration system and the migration cap were designed in the UK is following a strictly business model. Now, there are some domains that do not work strictly like business, and academia is one of them. Academia has very set cycles, so it has very specific times during the year when it hires people. So having monthly quotas to hire people is not going to work for a university because they have a peak of hiring. Now, this conundrum hasn't been sorted out at all so far. So universities are basically left in a situation where they have to make do with what has been imposed on them. And I have been told of many cases where people basically couldn't be hired even though the hiring process had already been going on for a 2-year cycle, even though they were part of an international team carrying out some very specific projects, even though those individuals had actually been drawing students towards them, because certain students want to study with certain academics. So many universities, such as the University of Cambridge, have now basically issued an unofficial policy of, if you can hire somebody who comes from the EU or the UK instead of a visa national, do so. This is the very pernicious thing about the migration policies in the UK, but generally migration policies, is that it ends up generating a system where the organizations themselves will end up limiting themselves and will end up regulating themselves. It generates a certain mentality where, because you are given no choice and because your economical viability in many cases depends on this, you take a few more steps than the ones that you're actually asked to follow. So we're seeing a general culture in the UK where not only are people very nervous, not only are people choosing the second best in many cases, we're also seeing a culture where people are becoming very suspicious. This is another very critical point with the migration policies in the UK, and that's in virtue of the monitoring duties that I discussed before. So basically, the UK has justified its points-based immigration system because previously individual border agents had supposedly too much power, arbitrary power, to decide who was left in and who was left out. So decided we're going to have a very clear one-size-fits-all system. And it's going to be very clear who's allowed and who's not allowed. But what they've done, because they didn't want to lose their ability to kind of tighten the ropes if they needed to, or just let off some steam, they didn't want to lose that ability to adjust the system, they put in fairly vague clauses and fairly vague duties. Now, this has made the organizations who are supposed to enforce those duties, it has made the sponsors very, very nervous, because they don't really know what they're meant to do. And so, in some cases, people are very brave and they say, well, we'll interpret this as liberally as we can. But most of them, sadly, have not gone down that route because they're too scared for, one, their funding, and they're too scared to be caught doing something that could be illegal, and therefore losing their sponsorship license, and therefore losing their revenues, or losing the ability to hire people. So we've seen in a lot of institutions, whether they're art organizations, whether they're universities, or whether they're companies, we've seen a lot of processes for monitoring those foreign individuals put in place that are way stricter than what is actually required by the government. Many universities have imposed ID swipe cards. Some of them don't even require any personnel, any staff to do this. Some of them are just little chip cards that are picked up by radio signal. So you can literally follow the movements of whoever carries that ID card. And another very vicious point of this is, in the UK we have equality laws. So you're not allowed to discriminate against any group of people. Now, clearly, if you're meant to monitor a certain group of people in virtue of the fact that you're discriminating. So what the collusion of these two laws has done is that the surveillance system for the university decided to actually enforce them even more than they need to, has been spread to the entire population. So it's not only the foreign employees, it's all employees. It's not only the foreign students, it's all students. So in a country that prides itself of not having ID cards, this has been the little loophole that's actually brought them back. Equally, it's made checks on passports, it's made checks on the right to work widespread. And this is not only quite frightening in terms of what it can do for our civil liberties, it's also very burdensome and it's also very costly. It's a very lengthy, time-consuming process, when actually there's enough processes in place already existing to do that job. But just in order to be compliant with the border agency and not to be at odds with the rules, these institutions decided to take that upon themselves. So they've self-generated a culture of suspicion and fear where they will double-check everything just to cover their backs. Now, the other thing that is also quite pernicious with this monitoring system is that basically the border agency, which is the agency that enforces migration rules, now has a right to come in and do spot checks whenever they like. So, whereas before universities were pretty much a safe haven sanctuary where the police wouldn't enter, they now have a right, in virtue of the sponsorship system, to come and check the files of all the employees, just to make sure that no breach of the rules is actually taking place. So not only are those institutions who are private institutions and who traditionally had a lot of autonomy from the states, not only are they forced to carry out certain duties of the state, but they've also lost the autonomy. There's absolutely nothing that prevents the border agency or a contractor of the border agency to come in and just ask for the files that they would like to have. Previously, you would have had to give an announcement. This is no longer the case. Now, another very problematic issue that we've come across is especially in arts and academia. A lot of what happens in arts and academia is very informal. It's very informal, and they're very lengthy collaborations that happens over time. They're very personal collaborations most of the times. Well, this is now no longer possible because you have to register and you have to go through this very lengthy process. And so a lot of projects that were to be carried out haven't been carried out because the people weren't given the visa. And sometimes for the most ridiculous of reasons. There was this one example of a Chinese businessman who was meant to be hired by a very big British company and whose visa ended up not being delivered because the exchange rate for the yen into pounds fluctuated ever so slightly within the period during which they have to have a certain amount of money on their bank account. And so he was short of 80 pence in his bank account. Now this is where simply following rules and not applying a certain common sense really comes into its own. The UK is ultimately shooting itself in the foot by doing this. But we've seen other many cases where academics were coming or artists were coming for conferences. Now, if you happen to be an academic or an artist that carries a big instrument or that has a canvas, you're quite obvious. You can't just, you stick out. We've come across many cases of such individuals that came for conferences were not being paid, so it can't even be argued that they were taking away revenues from British students. They were simply coming to participate in a conference. Now, the border agents saw them, singled them out, and told them, why are you coming to the UK? Okay, what is this instrument for? Are you planning to actually play it? And from the moment on that they said, yes, I plan to participate in a conference, and yes, I will be playing my instrument, or yes, this is my canvas, and these are my oils, and yes, I paint, this is what I do, I'm an artist, this is what I do, but no, I don't intend to sell anything. They told, well, this is work, because this is what you do. So ultimately, I have absolutely no reason to believe you that you're not going to be selling anything. I have absolutely no reason to believe you that you won't be using your instrument or whatever it is that you're carrying to also make money within this country. Now, this is another very grey area. This has basically given a very specific portion of the UK government the right to define what is work and what isn't. If you're an artist, how do you draw the line? What is work? Is work only the moment where you make money from what you've done? Is work the moment where you start having the idea for whatever product is going to be the result of that? Is work the moment where you're playing an instrument? Are you always working? Do you ever stop working? This is not a very clear-cut definition for an artist, nor is it a very clear-cut definition for an academic. But the border agency, because it doesn't actually have a grasp of those fields, because it has a very conservative definition of work, and because it sees foreigners as taking away, literally this is ultimately the problem, it sees foreigners as straining the resources of this poor little island which is already supposedly all overpopulated, has decided that in case of doubt, you take the most rigid stance, just to be sure. Now, there is some hope, thankfully, because along with a few other organizations, we're mounting a campaign for a judicial review on the definition of work that is being used by the border agency. Where that will lead us, we will see. But it has the potential of raising a fairly high-profile case. And there's nothing the government hates more than having very bad press. So we'll see where we go. And we might even have a successful legal challenge. So, I mean, this you can kind of see how the government is more and more creeping into various areas that didn't used to be under its remit. You can see how the government is more and more deciding what can be done on its territories. You can more and more see clearly how a government that is losing its ability to actually hold a social contract that binds it to its citizens, because nowadays so many issues are transnational and international, is reverting to the only thing that it can still kind of control. It's reverting to controlling who can enter its borders. Now, ultimately, this is quite inadequate a position, and this is quite it's an illusion. Because at the end of the day, you can forbid people from coming legally, you can reduce the legal numbers, you can reduce the numbers that you can count in and out, but all you do is you increase the numbers of people who will come illegally. And we've seen many, many cases of organizations that actually tell whoever they want to bring in, just come in as a tourist. Just don't say anything, just come in as a tourist. It's too risky, it's too costly, it's too lengthy for us, just come in as a tourist. So ultimately, what the government is doing is it's generating even more of a situation that it will be able to grab onto later on to say, well, see, there's more and more people who abuse our laws. There's more and more people who come in here as legal migrants. We need to tighten the screws a little bit. Migration policies ultimately don't do much else but to increase the number of illegal migrants, but to increase the number of people who break the laws. Because there's hardly anything that you can do against the desire of people to cross countries. People will do it. Not far from here in Lampedusa, they know that very well, and they see on a daily basis ships full of people who risk their lives to come. People will come because people want a better life for themselves, because people don't have a choice, because climatic changes happen and they can't provide for themselves, because people want to live a different way than the ones that they were born into. So it seems very absurd in a world such as our own, where you're asked and you're expected to move more and more, or you have no choice but to do that. It seems very absurd to actually want to regulate this, and it seems against the current to actually want to tighten your migration policies. We live in a world where most of us have lived in a different country. Actually, how many of you have lived in a different country than the one you were born in?
Define live. More than one.
Whatever, your definition of live is your definition of live. I mean, who am I to say, This is quite a good representation already. And we're fortunate enough to be able to actually admit to that. I sadly have many friends who are illegal migrants, and they would never be able to, to admit that, because if they did, their life would be in jeopardy. So I really give it to you that in a world where national borders are actually more and more porous, they're not only more and more porous to individuals, to migrants, they're just more and more porous. I mean, how many environmental issues cannot be dealt with by national, states? How many epidemics cannot be dealt with by national states? National states are no longer able to protect their citizens in the way they used to. They do not fulfill their duties of the social contract that they supposedly signed with us. So really, isn't it time that if the national state wants to remain relevant in this world, isn't it time that it becomes a bit more generous with the actual liberties that it grants people? Because what migration policies do, migration policies generate categories of individuals. They generate the category of individuals who have every single right, who equally have the right to partake in the political life. The second category is slightly less fortunate. They have some right, they have the right to come to the country, they have the right to a certain level of healthcare, but they're not allowed to partake in the political life of a country whose policies affect them. And then you have the third category of individuals who have absolutely no rights. Now, remember that 1 billion people. Within that 1 billion people, surely more than half of those have absolutely no rights. The other half will only have certain rights. Now, if I live in a country and I'm a long-term resident and I contribute to that country, I do want to have a say in how its policies affect me. This is my right. I don't see any point in me voting for a country's policies in which I no longer live. Why do I not have that right? So ultimately, this is about making those human rights, which sound grand on paper and which national states have all signed to. It's about making them truly real. It's about making them not only wonderful theories, it's about making them true civil rights. Thank you very much.